It's an adventure to get here, an extra adventure to actually explore the site, and overall a financial ripoff. But it is one of the new 7 wonders of the world, and the politics of this place is something that more people should know about. Welcome to Petra. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Today you're going to look at Petra, the second oldest of the new 7 wonders of the world, while I tell you things that are hardly available on the internet. And then at the end of the video I will make the case for why you should not visit Petra should you happen to be in Jordan, and recommend other places that I will show it to you several years from now when I'll come back to this country. The country is awesome, but Petra is kinda the exception in more ways than I can count. So, first things first. Nobody knows when this city was established. That's something no tour guide will tell you, but on site there is a mini museum that actually contains expert opinion from the people who've dedicated their lives to studying this site. On many tourist information guides and encyclopedias, you will see the year 312 BC as the year with which the history of this city starts. But in reality, 312 BC is the first time non-Arab powers attacked this city and also documented the attack. Antigonus I, a satrap under Alexander the Great, ordered an attack on the city, which is quite thoroughly documented by Greek historians. But in 312 BC, Petra was already a quite prosperous town and an established trade center, which is precisely why it was a target for attack to begin with. And make no mistake, the city suffered multiple attacks before 312 BC and many others after this date until 106 AD, when it was annexed by the Roman Empire and has since been known as Arabia Petrea. One should distinguish, though, between the place being inhabited and the place being a city. The area has been inhabited or served as a sanctuary for at least 4,500 years, if not more. But as a city, whether it was called Rakhmu, Selah, Rekem or other names, some of them unknown, the place has been a city since at least the 5th century BC. Jewish Roman 1st century AD historian Yosef ben Matityahu writes, citing contemporary sources, that the city called Petra by the Greeks was called Rekem in honor of the founder King Rekeme, who ruled in the 1300s before Christ. Long story short, this place is old, and most of the structures that can be seen today are between 1900 and 2400 years old. And here comes the second part that tourist guides will never tell you. More than half of the structures still standing in Petra are essentially unknown, as in nobody has a substantiated idea on what they were used for. The most famous structure, the treasury for instance, is called the treasury because there are several Bedouin legends about how this building allegedly contained, well, treasures. No treasure has been found in the last 200 or so years since they've been looking for them, but that's a story for another day. The most solid hypothesis is that the Al-Khazinat, or the treasury, was built to serve as a mausoleum and tomb in early 1st century AD during the reign of Haritat ur-Rebei, or Arethas IV, a highly influential Nabataean king who is also somewhat connected to the beheading of John the Baptist. Yeah, that John the Baptist. Welcome to the Middle East, where almost anything has a biblical connection, really. Now, once we established what we don't know about the city, let's review what we do know, which is a lot less than I would prefer, but more than it's being emphasized in tourist guides. So, this city has two very well-known and documented periods, the Nabatean period and the Roman period, then almost nothing till the 19th century. The Nabateans were a nomad Bedouin tribe for most of their existence, but a Bedouin tribe who used to write and also learn from previous mistakes. By the 5th century BC, the Nabateans already had enough knowledge to not just survive in the very harsh climate of this area, but also to thrive in it in ways that previous populations couldn't. From the 5th century and until their final defeat in 106 AD by the Roman Emperor Trajan, they controlled almost all of what is known in history as the incense route, which is the trade route by land connecting the rest of Arabia to Damascus. Petra was particularly important because it was also halfway on the land route between the Aqaba Gulf, which is also in Jordan, and the opening to the Mediterranean in what today is the Gaza Strip. In those times, the borders were a bit less clear, but the Nabataean Kingdom included almost all of what is today the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, as well as significant territories of modern-day Syria, Saudi Arabia, northeast Egypt, and Israel. Because the Nabateans knew their deserts so well, they managed to repeal attempts to have them conquered for more than 5 centuries until they were eventually defeated by the Romans. Petra rapidly became the capital of the Nabataean Kingdom, not only due to its excellent position on most trade routes, but also due to its natural landscape, which made it far easier to defend than other settlements. Culturally, the Nabateans have been described both by their enemies and their friends as being exceptionally fond of freedom, and that meant not just independence but also economic freedom, a concept which was still very, very rare at the time, almost anywhere on Earth. It is under this context that the Nabataean Kingdom kickstarts and nurtures a centuries-lasting friendly relationship with the neighboring Maccabees, a Jewish warrior population which, at one point in the 2nd and 1st century BC, had established a de facto Jewish state in the territory that is today Israel. The Nabataean Kingdom was one of the few places in the area that minted its own currency and had pretty elaborate codes making sure that the state doesn't get into deficit, while at the same time not subjugating the commerce that had propelled their kingdom to prosperity to begin with. In modern parlance, we can say without fear of being wrong that the Nabataean Kingdom was a pretty capitalistic place, breaking away from the norm of its times in many respects. We have to remember that in those times mercantilism was the absolute norm, and in many ways the Nabataean Kingdom was mercantilist, or at the very least mercantilistic as well. But unlike normative mercantilist areas, the kingdom was also concerned with trade deficit, external audits, private third-party contract brokers, and perhaps most spectacular, a general interest into expanding markets via economic persuasion of win-win situations, something which we now call capitalism. And obviously they had a strong military. Repealing Alexander the Great's army was no small thing, and being trustworthy enough for all the other kingdoms to rely that the contracts will be enforced was also something that could only exist because the Nabataean Kingdom was a lot more fond of the rule of law than the norm in its times. In fact, many of the cultural elements that set the Nabateans apart from the rest of the Arab and Bedouin tribes were good enough to be integrated into the wider Greco-Roman culture following the annexation of the kingdom in 106 Anno Domini. The Romans applied to the area the standard Roman policy: kill off the local dynasty, leave most of the rest of the people alone, but impose Roman institutions and insist on building Roman structures alongside the pre-existent ones. So that's how this Roman road came to existence, which is now used by carriages operated by scammers and some locals because tourists are naive enough to pay almost $30 for a relatively short and highly uncomfortable carriage ride. Around the same period, the Romans also built this Roman theater using Nabataeans' method of carving it out from the rock, a method which was then fully integrated into the Roman ways of doing things in such climates. The Romans also built a great pagan temple, but that one didn't survive the earthquake in the year 363 Anno Domini. The Romans also left quite a few marks on the Siq, which is this narrow passage that leads to the city itself, especially in the far eastern side of the Siq, where plenty of Roman motifs can be found, oftentimes alongside pre-Roman art, but also Christian Byzantine art. Basically, the glorified version of writing something on the wall to let people know you are there, and still visible to us thousands of years later. The ditch that you can see on the right of this image, although you might be tempted to think it's also Roman, it's actually what's left of the highly complex system of water management which allowed the city to exist and to prosper. Basically, the Nabateans had found the way to create a man-made oasis in the middle of nowhere that can also be successfully defended and was on important enough trade routes to host an entire civilization around it. That, my fellow deplorables, is no small thing. In fact, it is the most spectacular aspect of this place, even though it is the least explored part of the city by the tourists. The city continued to flourish under Roman rule for another century and a half, though it peaked both population-wise and civilization-wise a bit before the Roman conquest, at some point having as many as 21,000 inhabitants. To put this into perspective, Jerusalem, which was and had been a civilizational center in the same period, had about 70,000 inhabitants. But without the dynasty that civilized the area in the first place, combined with the increasing convenience of conducting trade by water rather than by caravans on land, alongside the harsh 363 AD earthquake, followed by another major earthquake in the year 551, not to mention the emergence of the Silk Road, which diverted trade away from this area and towards Damascus, and especially Tadmur or Palmyra, all of these factors and other smaller ones contributed to a slow but consistent decline of Petra from late 2nd century AD onwards. By the time the Muslim Arabs conquered the area in the 7th century, the city was, for all intents and purposes, essentially abandoned. Historians say that the earthquake in 551 was the final nail in the coffin, as it damaged the water management system irreparably, since the knowledge of how to fix and maintain it had become either very hard to acquire or simply lost. And by 551 it was hardly even worth anymore to try to keep the city alive as a city rather than just a small settlement, if anything. With that said, the city did remain active for a lot longer than you will see in tourist guides. Recent excavations of portions or of even entire churches show that the place was at the very least one of religious significance even after it lost its status and glory as a regional player during the Byzantine era. This is a portion of Petra's history that might become known in the following years, since many of the documents about this period were excavated relatively recently, and as such, they are still subject to dispute amongst historians, and many of them are hard to find in digital format, so one should suspend judgment for the time being. What I will say is that the Christian period, however long it may have been, was clearly strong enough for it to generate the monastery you're looking at right now, as well as multiple churches around the area, not to mention the occasional Christian symbolism even on some of the tombs. Those tombs were either post-factum made Christian, which is a distinct possibility, or they were built indeed after the Romans left, which suggests that the city was active at least one more century after the 363 earthquake. Because we know that the Romans forbade the building of new tombs, and there is no clear evidence of any new ones being built whilst the city was still thriving under Roman rule. I don't know what is the answer, but it's clearly a topic that is worthy of attention of those preoccupied with the history of Christianity or of religion in general in the area. What we do know for sure is that when the Islamic era begins, it most definitely did not affect Petra itself. Local historians suggest that by the time Islam spread in this region, the de facto locality was Wadi Musa, or the Valley of Moses, a locality that still exists today, but which in the 7th century was not literally glued to Petra as it is today, but several kilometers up on the hill closer to what is today known as Ain Musa, or the Moses Water Spring, which allegedly emerged when Moses hit the site with his staff and water started flowing. Wadi Musa today is quite literally glued to Petra, and it is entirely a tourist town with ridiculously overpriced stuff, unless you know what you're doing and you know how to negotiate. Now, I won't go too much through the modern period because that's easily available information and most of it is quite far from interesting, to be honest. I will say that nobody really knows what happened in Petra between the 7th century and early 19th century. In this 1200 years period, there are only sporadic mentions in canonical history, as certain medieval sultans are said to have visited the site out of curiosity. What we do know is that from the 19th century and until today, there has been a consistent human population in the area, even if the Jordanian government didn't particularly like that. In 1985, as part of the process to get the place designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Jordanian government attempted to forcibly move out the Bedouins from the cave dwellings into housing around the area, particularly Wadi Musa, but also smaller villages and towns in the Petra department. This obviously didn't work, since there are still between several hundreds and a couple of thousand Bedouins who still live full-time in some way, shape or form inside the site. That would be one problem. Another problem is that tourism, the way it is being done at this moment in the site, is not particularly sustainable. In fairness, the Jordanian Ministry of Tourism has taken steps to secure both private and public investment into reorganizing the area to make things better. And some changes are already visible if you compare my footage taken in October 2018 with footage taken 8 or 10 years ago. With that said, it's quite far from enough, and sadly, some areas of the site have now become completely off-limits due to the stupidity of tourists combined with the lack of proper guidance and really proper channels for more interested explorers. As a result, the chaps dressed as Roman soldiers that you see in front of the treasury are not just good decoration, but they also serve to tell everyone that it is forbidden to go inside the treasury. This is because many tourists screamed inside and put their hands all over the place, so now the structure of the building has been affected and there are white spots on the interior walls where the tourists touched or rubbed against the wall the most. Overall, this is kinda terrible. With that said, new things are being discovered every year, so it is very likely that in another 10 years we will know more about the history of this place, and likely we will also have more questions. Alright, I said at the beginning that I will make the case for why you should not come to Petra should you be in Jordan and instead head towards other places such as Wadi Rum and Aqaba, two locations that I deeply regretted not having the time or the funds to cover in this tour. Don't do like I did and head towards those instead of Petra. First of all, the entrance fee for 1 day is 50 Jordanian dinars, 55 for 2 days. That's about 78 US dollars. You can lower that fee a bit if you use the Jordan Pass trick that I used, namely to pay about $100, which includes the entrance fee into the country and access to all tourist attractions in the country, including Petra for 2 days. But it's still expensive. This doesn't include the Petra by night show, which costs an additional $20, but which I avoided because it was too crowded and it would not have made sense to pay the money and not get proper video from it. If you are a resident in Jordan, however, entrance fee is just 1 dinar or $1.50. This is standard practice in most attractions in the Arab world, where the price for locals is oftentimes a tiny fraction of what they charge foreigners. Then there is, everything else. While you can, if you are an experienced traveler, you can find cheap housing relatively close to the site and also food that is good, a bit expensive but not ridiculously overpriced. While you can do all of that, you can't avoid the prices for water and tea, which you will absolutely need plenty of. Trust me on that. Also, you can't do much about the ridiculous prices for a cab fare. Basically, the first day, out of a group of 40-ish tourists that got out of the site at almost the same time as I did, only one, myself, paid a reasonable cab fare back to the hotel. And that's because I'm a harsh negotiator and I don't shy away from arguing for 5 or 10 minutes with a cab driver. If you don't do that, get ready to pay in 2 days at least 40 US dollars in cab fares for 2 or 3 kilometers ride at best. The cab fares, if you don't negotiate, are 5 to 7 times higher than the cab fares in Amman, even if you don't negotiate in Amman, which you should as well, but that's a story for another day. Then there's the issue inside the site, with a bajillion scammers approaching you every other minute. I've had quite a few shots ruined by scammers walking up to me to ask me if I want to pay them a fortune to take me by the donkey for 2 kilometers. Now, I had done my homework, so I knew all the bullcrap that I had to expect, but far too many people don't do that and end up in highly unpleasant situations. For instance, officially it is included in your ticket a trip by horse from the treasury to the main eastern exit at the visitor center. But the handlers will shamelessly ask for a 10 and up to 20 dinars tip. And if you refuse or don't pay them enough, you'll find yourself surrounded by what are essentially gypsies posing as Bedouins. Now, if you're someone like me, you can just tell them to fuck off and walk away. They're not going to hurt you because there's the tourist police nearby, and while the tourist police does tolerate swindling and the occasional animal abuse, they absolutely do not tolerate intentional harm being done to tourists, and the swindlers know that all too well. But many, if not most tourists, are older people or physically small women. A gang of 5 or 7 quote-unquote Bedouins can be pretty persuasive to enough tourists. Also, many aspects of the site are completely untransparent. For instance, it is not clear at all which areas are allowed and which areas are not allowed. This creates an incentive for corruption amongst the handlers of the site, who oftentimes charge between 1 dinar and up to 20, depending on the face of the tourist basically, to take you to places which they say are forbidden, but places in which you could otherwise go by yourself without paying a dime to them. It is overall incredibly confusing and prone to abuse. And again, the fact that it is expensive would be less of a problem if it were transparent, upfront, and easy to follow. But it is none of these things. The only exception is the difficulty of the trails. If it says hard, then the trail is indeed hard. And if it says easy, it means easy for people accustomed to walking through harsh climate. But that's the only portion where I can say definitely that things are transparent and upfront. Everything else, it's mostly guesswork and almost always inconsistent. Again, this didn't bother me really that much because I'm accustomed to these things, but if you're not an experienced traveler, you might want to avoid Petra, at least for the time being, until you accumulate more experience. What I got to give to the swindlers though is how in line with modern technology they are. You can pay the tip for the donkey ride with the credit card. They have a POS powered by solar batteries, and some donkeys have Visa and MasterCard signs painted on them. Now, I would never, in good conscience, advise anyone to pay anything to these people via credit card, but it was funny to notice that swindling is very well organized for sure. Now, make no mistake, the average Jordanians are fully aware of some of these things, and they're not particularly happy about it, because if Petra is the only thing tourists see in Jordan, that means they get a far worse impression of the country as a whole than the country would deserve. And they're right to be pissed off, because most of the country is actually really nice. But more on that in a future video. So, to sum up, Petra is a site that is irresponsibly exploited, but a site that most definitely deserves full attention from archaeologists and other relevant scientists, because the history of this place is absolutely fascinating. The campus of the College of Archaeology, Tourism and Hotel Management of the Al Hussein bin Talal University is located nearby in Wadi Musa, and both the government and the private sector do invest in researching the site further. So, that's nice, for sure. But in the meantime, until at least some of the issues are corrected, I would not, in good conscience, advise people to come here. Should you choose to come here against my recommendations, make sure you do your homework if you care about your budget. Otherwise, you'll end up in trouble. And I guess that's pretty much it. Obviously, I left out quite a lot, especially from the modern era, but that's because I didn't go to Petra to study the modern era. If you're interested in the Indiana Jones stories, there's plenty of resources online to help you with that. And while the modern era saw the economic uplift of this area to levels unimaginable 100 years ago, almost entirely thanks to tourism and film crews being around, additional care needs to be taken in order to avoid killing the goose that lays the golden eggs, either by pissing off too many tourists via tolerating the tremendous amount of swindling, or by ruining the site via unwise exploitation. Notice that it's the site's integrity that I care about. Most Western SJWs who happen to be tourists in the area complain about the poor donkeys or about the local culture being consumed by the tourists. To be honest, those are marginal concerns at best. This concludes the episode on Petra. After 2 days in which I walked a total of at least 40 kilometers through rocky desert without including the harsh hike all the way up to the monastery, I took the bus and headed back to Amman. There's nothing more relieving than getting back to Amman after 2 very long days in Petra. In the next video from this tour, I'll tell you about Amman and the Jordanian society, again with a focus on the issues hardly available in English on the internet. The purpose of these tours, in addition to political research, is to bring aspects that no travel vlog would dare to bring up. That's because the purpose is not to convince tourists, but to live up to the intro of every video. Let's explore. And all of that is possible thanks to you, the audience who's been supporting these endeavors for more than 3 years now, and for which I am deeply grateful. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider making a donation should you derive any value from the work being done here. Please subscribe to my social media, and I will see you all quite soon on the Freedom Alternative.